Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Allan Holdsworth has long been regarded as one of the great guitar players of the jazz fusion and progressive rock movements of the 1970s. His technique is very unique and has been acclaimed by players as diverse in style as Frank Zappa on one hand and Eddie Van Halen on the other. He has appeared on quite a few notable albums, including records from the Tony Williams lifetime, Jean-Luc Ponty, Bill Bruford, and with Bruford, Holdsworth appeared on the classic debut album by the British prog rock band UK. Holdsworth definitely did make a mark. He also made quite a few solo albums, or albums where he worked as a band leader over the course of his career. Some of these were more successful than others. An album that is particularly notable in his catalog is one that Holdsworth, had he had his way, wouldn't ever have seen the light of day. That is his first album from 1976, Velvet Darkness. Holdsworth went on record on numerous occasions over the course of his career as absolutely despising Velvet Darkness, to the point where he claimed that he never received royalties for it, that it was no more than a rehearsal, that its release was unauthorized, and that people shouldn't buy it, that it shouldn't be considered a part of his official catalog. I'm not personally sure all those statements are true, quite frankly, but I certainly understand why Holdsworth might have had some misconceptions about that album and was surprised at the manner in which it was made. In order to delve into that, a little bit of background is necessary. By 1976, when Velvet Darkness was made, Allan Holdsworth was not quite 30 years old, but he had been doing a lot of work on the British and American rock and jazz scene. He had made records going back as far as 1969 and had appeared on various albums over that stretch by Tempest, by Soft Machine, and with the Tony Williams lifetime. Holdsworth linked up with Williams in an interesting way. Holdsworth had been performing as part of another band where that band opened at a gig at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London for Chuck Mangione. Holdsworth became acquainted with Mangione's bass player, Alphonso Johnson, and impressed him to the point that about a year later, when Tony Williams was looking for a guitar player in relaunching his band Lifetime from the late 1960s and early 70s, Johnson recommended Holdsworth to him, and without an audition, Holdsworth became part of the band. Holdsworth made 2 albums with Lifetime, and over the course of that stretch established a great rapport not only with Tony Williams, but with the band's keyboard player, Alan Pasqua. They made their records in the United States the first time that Holdsworth emigrated from England to the States to work on recordings. And between touring the United States and recording in the States, Holdsworth became acquainted with numerous people on the jazz scene. One person in particular that he became friends with was the guitarist George Benson. By 1976, Benson was beginning to see his star rise. Benson's album Breezing, his first album for the Warner Brothers label, was a huge hit, going multi-platinum, a very rare occurrence for a jazz-flavored record. But prior to joining Warner Brothers, Benson had spent some 5.5 years recording for an independent label, CTI Records. And upon seeing Holdsworth's talent, Benson made the recommendation to CTI's boss, Creed Taylor, that he consider recording Holdsworth for a jazz album. Holdsworth made the connection with Taylor, and a contract was signed, a one-album contract to produce an album in mid-1976. A one-album contract might sound a little bit odd for people not familiar with the jazz scene of the 1950s and 1960s. In fact, for many of the small jazz labels based in New York in particular in that period, one-album contracts were very much the norm unless you were a superstar of the stature of, say, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, or Thelonious Monk. Most of these labels were very small operations. The Prestige, Blue Note, and Riverside labels, in particular, all based in New York, were effectively run by their owners who happened to be jazz aficionados and who made records on very tight budgets. These labels had offices in New York or in northern New Jersey, but generally did not have their own recording facilities. The three labels I just mentioned in particular made most of their recordings at a single studio with an independent engineer, Rudy Van Gelder. Van Gelder's studios, first in Hackensack and later in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, were somewhat legendary. Many, many great recordings by the jazz greats of the day recorded at Van Gelder's. Virtually all the records from Prestige, Blue Note, and Riverside were made there, as well as records by the ABC Impulse label, which Creed Taylor ran for a time, and from Verve Records, a subsidiary of MGM, which Taylor also ran. By 1967, Creed Taylor founded CTI Records, Creed Taylor International, and continued in this vein, making records with Rudy Van Gelder at his studio for some jazz luminaries of the time. Besides George Benson recording at CTI, other great musicians, including Wes Montgomery, Antonio Carlos Jobim, Umir Deodato, Bob James, and Grover Washington Jr. recorded at CTI. There were both advantages and disadvantages to artists working at CTI and, for that matter, at the other small jazz labels of the 60s and 70s. From an artistic perspective, these labels could be a very creative and very productive place for an artist honing their craft to work, because these labels generally gave the artist full artistic freedom in terms of what they wanted to create. The heads of these labels weren't musicians in their own right, as much as they were jazz fans who might know a little bit about the current marketplace, and their real interest in producing product was just to make sure that they could do so at a reasonable cost. It was not uncommon for recording artists to make several albums a year at the small labels, depending upon what artistic bent they wanted to take and who they were performing with at the time. The artistic freedom at CTI allowed Holdsworth to select the artists that he would work with on his first album. And he selected a band of people who were friends, who were also terrific musicians. He selected for Velvet Darkness the bassist Alphonso Johnson, perhaps in some regards as a thank you for Johnson's hooking Holdsworth up with Tony Williams for the Lifetime gig. Alan Pasqua, Allan Holdsworth's friend from Lifetime, also appeared on Velvet Darkness on keyboards, and Pasqua enlisted a friend of his, a young drummer named Michael Walden, now known as Narada Michael Walden, in order to join them as well. Where working with CTI and the other jazz labels was often difficult for artists was on the business end. As I mentioned, Allan Holdsworth's contract with CTI for what would become Velvet Darkness was a single album deal. Single album deals obviously don't give the record label very much incentive to invest in the artist. And as I said, priority for Creed Taylor at CTI was to minimize costs. The contract resulted in CTI booking just a single session at Rudy Van Gelder's studio for Holdsworth and his band to record the album. The other area that often became sticky with the jazz labels of the day was in payment for their work. Royalties for jazz albums oftentimes were very low to start with, and at some companies, royalties weren't even paid. Instead, the labels would opt to pay the artist for the session upfront in a lump sum in exchange not only for their performance, but for the publishing of any new songs that came out of the session. This is a rather unsavory practice that went back to the jazz era of the 1950s. In some cases back in those days, sadly, the artists were drug addicted, and this was a ploy that was used by less than reputable business owners. In the worst of cases, an artist that might be strung out and looking for his next fix of heroin to take as little money as possible for his work. That is unfortunately the reality of the business environment in which Holdsworth and his band were working. And it appears that none of the members of the band, nor Holdsworth himself, were familiar with some of the business practices that were pursued in this segment of the business. Holdsworth, at age 29, was the oldest member of the band, and of course was English and didn't have very much experience dealing with American record executives. The other members of his band, Pasqua, Johnson, and Walden, were a bit younger and had not worked at CTI before, so they were also unfamiliar with how this particular company did business. As a result, Velvet Darkness was made very quickly. Some sources say that the album was made in a single session in mid-June of 1976. Others suggest that the album was made over the course of 2 sessions at Van Gelder's studio in late May. Regardless, it was done fairly quickly. It probably was not, as Holdsworth suggests, a rehearsal. I think Holdsworth would have preferred to have at least one more session under his belt to allow the band to gel on the songs, all of which were Holdsworth originals, and some of which had been written a few years before and had appeared in various themes or solos from them used in earlier work. But in any event, I doubt that the sessions were truly rehearsals insofar as that several of the tracks on the album, particularly those that made use of Holdsworth playing acoustic guitar or the violin, as well as electric guitar, employed overdubs, which ordinarily at a session that was conducted strictly as a rehearsal, overdubs typically would not be used. Van Gelder's technique would often be to record a 2-track master in a live session in his studio and then transfer that to lacquer and to stampers. Van Gelder was a master recording engineer and mastering engineer and had his own lathe and cutting equipment for mastering of records. Again, a skill that was very useful to these small record companies that wanted to keep their costs down. Van Gelder was a wizard. He knew his craft well and would produce some amazing recordings, but he generally pursued the most economical path in order to satisfy the record companies who were paying his bills. So the bottom line of all of this is Velvet Darkness was made very quickly. It was made with very few takes. There have been some reissues of the album that have taken place over the years where it's clear that multiple takes of certain of the tracks were done. So in that regard, the reissues tell us a little bit about the nature of the sessions and what was available in order to assemble an album. And the album is a very short one, running just barely a half an hour in length. I can certainly, from an artistic perspective, understand why Holdsworth didn't particularly like it. And I have no doubt that he expressed those concerns to Rudy Van Gelder and to Creed Taylor when the session was done. If he had signed a contract, however, that indicated that Taylor had the rights to release the album, unfortunately, there was not very much he could do about the matter. Things were probably also somewhat complicated by a business matter outside of Holdsworth's understanding. CTI Records by 1976 was nearing bankruptcy and had a relationship with a national distributor through Motown Records that was evidently souring. CTI was at this time not making very much in the way of a new product for Motown to distribute, and this might have contributed to either financial or legal issues between CTI and Motown. In any event, it could very well have been that even if Taylor had wanted to honor Holdsworth's wishes and not release the album, he may not have had a choice in order to keep his partners at Motown happy and, in order to keep out of court. I would not dismiss the album as far as its content. It is probably not Allan Holdsworth's greatest moment. I won't represent it as being such. But there are some very interesting songs on it of a jazz fusion form. It's not unlike another album of its time period, which in fact Michael Walden also appeared on. Jeff Beck's Wired also came out in mid-1976 and features Walden on several selections. And there are some aspects of Velvet Darkness that do have a similar feel. The acoustic tracks on Velvet Darkness are very pretty. Allan Holdsworth never regarded himself to be a great acoustic guitar player, but the work on Velvet Darkness, I think, contradicts that a bit. They are very tasty, a little bit on the short side, but very pleasant. And overall, they're a very worthwhile listen. So anyway, that is the story. That's how I view it, and I'm sticking to it. I'm very curious to hear what you and the audience think, both of the album and of my assessment and analysis of it. Please feel free to share your comments and let me know what you think. If you enjoy what you're seeing on this episode and on the channel in general, please subscribe, and we'll hope to have you back soon. You take very good care. Bye-bye.